This video is going to be about cell transport used in multicellular organisms. Basically, how particular transport methods are actually used in organ systems like the respiratory system and urinary system. So our objectives are to explain how different organisms obtain oxygen and how we as humans and other land animals have adapted to breathe on land, and explain how various organisms are adapted to maintain water balance while processing nitrogen wastes. Basically, learn the urinary system. So to begin with, animals need to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen for cellular respiration because we produce carbon dioxide as a waste product and we need oxygen in order to survive. Plants need to do the opposite, so they need to take in carbon dioxide and get rid of oxygen. And this occurs by diffusion across a membrane. Diffusion is a type of passive transport where molecules move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And therefore, the efficiency is increased if you have a larger surface area. So in most of these organ systems, the larger the surface area relative to volume ratio we have, the more efficient you are. So in fish, they breathe through gills, and it is an extremely efficient process. The way they do this is using gill filaments. Gill filaments create larger surface area for the gills and therefore for diffusion across the membrane. They also use this method of countercurrent flow, which basically is where the blood and water flow in opposite directions. This allows for the water always to have a higher oxygen concentration, so therefore the oxygen will always flow from the water to the blood. If you look at the picture on the right, it shows that in the water flow there's low oxygen. There's also low oxygen in the blood, and therefore oxygen will still flow from the water to the blood because there's still going to be a concentration gradient. This is extremely important in order for the efficiency. So this is how gills work, and they are very, very efficient. Unfortunately, we can't use gills because we live on land. We had to adapt to live on land because the problem with living on land is we would dry out, the gills would dry out, and therefore the gas would not be exchanged because gas needs to be dissolved in water in order to move through the membrane. So therefore, we had to evolve in order to be able to get oxygen out of the atmosphere by having a space inside us. That decreases the evaporation, and therefore those membranes stay moist. We use our respiratory system, and our air comes in through your nose and your mouth and goes down your pharynx, and then your pharynx goes into your larynx, which is, if you remember, the epiglottis covers your larynx when you're eating. Well, when you're breathing, it opens it up and allows the air to go from your pharynx to your larynx and then to your trachea, which is slightly different from your larynx because it is actually harder to collapse. And if you've heard of a tracheotomy, that's when they actually put a hole into your trachea. So instead of having air go through your nose and lungs, pharynx and larynx, it goes straight into your trachea. And then you end up in your bronchi, which is where the tube branches and ends up at your lungs. And your lungs are a whole bunch of alveoli. So they're not two big bags, they're a whole bunch of small bags and actually look like a sack of grapes. And this, kind of like the gill filaments, increases your surface area, so therefore more gas exchange can take place because the alveoli is actually where the gas exchange takes place. So if you see this picture, you'll notice that the alveoli are covered with capillaries that have blood coming to them with very low oxygen and very high CO2. So that means the CO2 will diffuse into the lungs, going from a high concentration of CO2 to a low concentration of CO2, and then the oxygen that's in the lungs with the high concentration go into your blood, which is the low concentration of oxygen. So it is an easy exchange of CO2 and O2. So when you breathe in, you're breathing in oxygen, bringing it to your capillaries, and then the capillaries are putting carbon dioxide into your lungs so that when you breathe out carbon dioxide. And then once it gets actually into your blood, you'll see the O2 from your lungs go into your bloodstream and then end up in all your cells. And that's the purpose of your circulatory system, is to bring the oxygen from your lungs to the rest of your body. So once it gets to your cells that need oxygen, again, concentration gradient makes diffusion occur because there's going to be high oxygen concentration in your blood and low concentration in your cells. Now on to the urinary system, which also uses diffusion and osmosis a lot. The purpose of your urinary system is for waste removal, because we can't just get rid of waste easily because our waste is often poisonous to us, so we have to figure out a way to keep it away from our blood, so we have specialized organs in order to get rid of our waste. Fish actually just remove waste through their gills. So our urinary system is composed of kidneys, blood vessels, and plumbing. You basically have the kidneys that kind of do look like kidney beans, and you have two of them, and then within each kidney you have a whole bunch of these things called nephrons. And then you have your plumbing, are all those tubes, and those are all surrounded by your blood vessels. And those nephrons also have each individual little piece. They have the glomerular capsule, the glomerulus, the capillaries, the tubule, and the collecting tubule. And then that actually ends up in the ureter, which the ureter brings the waste from the kidneys to the bladder, and then the urethra is the one tube that brings it out of your body, and the bladder is just the storage area for your waste. To begin with, you have your kidneys that are composed of nephrons, as I said, and each part of your nephron has a specific function. Blood enters your kidney through your renal artery and goes into your nephron. And the first thing that happens is filtration. So the glomerulus is the place where everything in your blood except for your blood cells go into this capsule. So your plasma, your waste, your salts, your ions, your glucose, anything other than your blood cells goes into the capsule. And then what happens is it goes into that tubule, and that's when you reabsorb majority of the stuff. So from the capsule, it goes into the tubule, all this stuff, and then as you see, you have blood vessels that surround the tubules that reabsorb the substances that are needed. And they actually reabsorb by both osmosis, which is the water, and also active transport. If they notice that there are sugars or amino acids or something that you actually need, they will actively bring it back into your blood. And this is actually where there could be some control by your body, and it actually can control what you take back into your blood. So if they know that you're low on sugar, they'll bring more sugar back in. So that's what happens in the tubule, and then the last stage is secretion. Basically what's left over after reabsorption, because that is supposedly your waste, is excreted through your ureter, that goes into your bladder, and then your bladder into your urethra. So that is how it exits your body. The idea is that whatever is not reabsorbed is waste. Now, you might actually be getting rid of things that you could need, but maybe you do not need it right then. So how you actually regulate what you're reabsorbing is through a hormone balance, and there are these things in your body, and there's a negative feedback regulation and positive feedback regulation, and these you can find throughout your entire body. And one example is with your kidneys, and you have a negative feedback regulation, and it's when potassium levels in the blood are too high. This hormone called aldosterone is released, and this causes the blood to release potassium ions into the tubule because your potassium levels are too high, so the blood wants to get rid of it. So it makes sure that it does not reabsorb the potassium, and so you're getting rid of your potassium ions, and this lowers your potassium ion in your blood, and when it gets to a certain level that is low enough, then aldosterone levels stop, and this is known as negative feedback because the hormone is secreted, lowers the level, and the lower level makes the hormone stop. So it's the lowering of the level, negative feedback. Then there's also positive feedback, which is kind of the opposite of negative feedback. And an example of this is when you're dehydrated. Dehydration means that you have less water in your blood, and therefore your blood decreases, and therefore your blood pressure decreases. So your blood pressure goes low, and that makes your antidiuretic hormone released. And what your antidiuretic hormone does, it's kind of like the anti-diarrhea, it stops diarrhea, so you actually reabsorb more water. So therefore, more water goes back into the bloodstream in that tubule. And then because of that, your blood pressure increases, which your brain notices and stops secreting the ADH. So the increase in blood pressure stopped the hormone, hence the positive feedback. So positive feedback means if an increased level stops it, a negative feedback is if a decreased level stops it. It is a very confusing process, and there are a whole bunch of examples of this throughout your body that we'll be going over and over, but it is a good way to think about how you actually regulate things in your body. How does your body know when to release certain things? And it is through these feedback mechanisms. So that is it. That's how you breathe and that's how you pee. Now, who has to go to the bathroom?